Hi, and welcome to week one's lecture. This week we're going to look at what ecology is, how we are using resources, the issues that we have that might be negative, and start to looking at some ways that we can use resources more sustainably for future generations. Ecology is simply the study of the interrelation among organisms with their environment. And if you look at all of the living things from the bottom of the ocean to the highest peak, this is called the biosphere. Now, if we want to look at ways to manage ecology, what we want to understand is how all of these levels are interconnected and how we can protect the interrelationships that we see among them. When we look at the resources here, we want to find ways that we can have a system of sustainable resource management. And this is just how we can develop and use sustainable practices, whether it's within industries, governments, agriculture, or just what we do as individual human beings to ensure the long-term health of our ecosystem. Now, there are three big things that we're going to look at that affect the world the most. The first is overpopulation and increased population. Currently, there are over 7 billion people on the earth, and it's projected that in 2050 there will be 9.5 billion people, and that by 2100 there will be over 11 billion people. So we're looking at exponential population growth. And as the population growth, there's going to be a demand on resources for water, clothing, fuel, and what can we do that would help to sustain or extend these resources or renew them so that as the population increases, these will be available for future generation. The other thing with increased population is an increased level of pollution. Right now, with the atmospheric gases that we're putting up, the air pollution and the water pollution, these are only going to be increased with the more people that we have, the more industries that we have, and the more resources that we're using. Which leads us to the second principle, which is the rate at which we are using resources and how quickly we are depleting the supplies that we have on the earth. Right now, we are already consuming the natural resources that we have, whether it's water or coal, at a rate that is 30% greater than they can be renewed in the future. We're also using farmland unsustainably so that it will not be as fertile and it will not be available for future generations. The third is pollution. And both from the extraction through the processing to the use of these resources, we are producing these changes in our atmosphere, in our forests, in our ground, and in our water supplies, whether it's from fertilizer or sewage disposal that we have. We are using it at a rate where it is not being able to replenish itself and renew itself at the current rate at where we are right now. So for future generations, whether it's humans or animals or forests, that they're going to be able to have the ability to thrive. So are we on the sustainable course? Can we maintain right now the standard of living that we have in this world into the next generation? Or have we exceeded the amount of resources and pollution and number of people living that's even going to allow for the next generation to really survive, let alone thrive, over the next 50 or 100 years? And this is what we call critical limits. There's a carrying capacity of the world, and that's the ability of an ecosystem to support a population of any given species for not only now, but also for it to be able to live and absorb wastes in the future. And right now we have exceeded the critical limits of what the earth can sustain. The earth is the sink for all of our waste. So in addition to having to be fruitful, it also has to absorb and cleanse all of the pollution that we're putting in there, which it's capable of doing, but not at the rate that we're currently doing it. So The things that we need to realize is first is that the Earth's resources are limited. There's a finite amount of them and they need to be managed carefully. The second is that humans are part of nature, that the Earth's resources are not exclusive for humans. There are other species that need these resources to survive and to prosper. So we're all dependent on nature in different ways. And we're going to see throughout this class that the key to success is really to cooperate with nature because we're inextricably linked. The way that we affect nature in turn will decide how nature is able to treat us depending on how we treat it. And there are systems that are essential to our welfare. Now, there are some biological principles of sustainability that we're using now and that I think will have expanded roles in the future as technology grows. The first is conservation. Are there ways that we can conserve the amount of resources that we're using now? An example would be if you are irrigating your farm, there are ways to use drip irrigation that will use 75 to 90% less water and you'll still be able to have the same yield of your crop. So we can conserve that. The second is recycling. Our landfills are overfull and we're having to find ways now that we can take what we have, whether it's plastic bottles or whether it's batteries, that we can take those resources and we can be able to renew them and use them again. We're going to look at renewable resource use, and this is really specific to the energy industry, where there's hydropower, where there's wind energy, things that we can capture that are renewable resources. They're not going to go away. And so being able to invent ways, increase technologies, and make them available to people so that there's a constant supply of energy that's not polluting the planet. Restoration. There are ways where, excuse me, areas that have been deforested now, we're finding ways to enhance those and restore those areas so that they can come back to an area where they're usable for humans and animals. And they're also producing oxygen to clean the air. So there are ways that we're looking at now where areas can be restored to a status where they're healthy environments. And the final is adaptability. We do have ways that we're doing things right now that if we just take the time to look at it and see if we can change some of these processes just a little bit, they can have extreme benefits. So those are some of the principles of sustainability that we're going to look at throughout the course. The last thing I want to talk about is more developed countries and less developed countries. We're going to see that in population growth, in resource use, in agricultural land, that there are two very different sets of countries out there. More developed countries, it's generally been based on economic status. You have a higher GDP, the people have a higher income and a higher standard of living. The next is most of these countries have been able to go through an industrial revolution. The good thing about that is we're at a point where we have technology and we're moved beyond it. The hard thing is that during the Industrial Revolution, we didn't realize how much we were polluting the world around us. So most of the more developed countries have been through industrialization and are actually in a phase called post-industrialization. Another measurement that the UN created is the Human Development Index, which gives not only economic, but it is about is there clean drinking water, is the life expectancy long, is there education available, and all of these things affect the way that we treat the land, the way that we can harvest resources, and whether or not even populations can feed themselves. So in more developed countries, there's also infrastructure. We have trains, we have roads. If we have a product that we're putting together, then we can actually take it and then we can export it. And what we're going to see in less developed countries is that most of them, first of all, survive by subsistence agriculture, and that is just where the family farms just to produce enough food for itself to live. There's not excess for it to be able to even sold at market. So they're very dependent on the weather, on climate, on soil conditions, but they don't have the infrastructure that a lot of these countries have. Large amounts of natural resources, but from extracting them and being able to package them and then send them for export, the system is just not in place there. So we're going to see how the more developed countries and the less developed countries are having to deal with the same issues in very different ways. And so there may be different solutions for different types of countries. So I hope that that was a good lecture for you. And if you have any questions, just send me an email. Thanks for listening.